What Chinese want. Now this is thoughtful. Hello, I'm Trevor Lai in Shanghai. China has emerged as a political superpower in the last 20 years, a remarkable achievement. It has also become a major economic power with vast consumer spending. China is now the leading consumer market today for everything from cars to cognac. This week on Thoughtful China, we'll look at China's rise as well as the misconceptions that exist between Western and Chinese businesses, each looking to expand at home and overseas, with Tom Doctoroff, JWT's CEO for North Asia. Tom, in your new book, What Chinese Want, you compare the strengths and weaknesses of Chinese companies. Well, let's start with what impresses you about Chinese companies.
Well, I think anybody that's been here for a long time, there are a few things that pop up as really Herculean in ambition. I think that the Chinese ability to manage scale is extremely impressive. So their ability to create order from chaos across broad swaths of space, across different city tiers, is very impressive. And this, of course, also leads to economies of scale, leading to a pretty good price-value equation across a broad variety of goods. So Chinese do know how to make things and distribute them in a very efficient way, and that's a real impressive thing.
Do you think they're actually underappreciated in the global business press for their management abilities?
Well, that's a very subjective and question. In terms of management, you have to ask the question, to what end? What is our goal? Is management designed to do more for less, for more people? In that case, I think they're good. I just think this is called by some people now frugal innovation. And in that sense, the Chinese, I think, are very strong. If you're talking about, on the other hand, management for price-value superiority that can afford a price premium rooted in innovation and breakthrough, in that case, the Chinese are not setting the standards for world-class management.
And perhaps branching out from that, actually visionary leadership, which...
Well, again, I think there is no Apple in the incubation stage here, but you have to ask visionary for what? When you think about the Chinese challenges, and the Chinese, to their credit, realize that the biggest challenges are here in China. There is, until recently, a primordial sea when it comes to the operational landscape, and the ability to impose order on that, right down into the rural fringe and beyond. When you take a look at what Lenovo is capable of doing in terms of penetrating the hinterland, it's extremely impressive. The automobile manufacturers, I think it's impressive too in terms of their reach, their ambition of scale. And other categories, from beer to milk, I know that's a controversial one. So the ability to manage scale and bring benefits to a large swath of the population, I think is very impressive. Because I think the Chinese companies also boast other strengths as well that's related to that. The first one is they're extremely incremental. The Chinese like to slowly but surely, relentlessly, sometimes ruthlessly crawl up the value chain. So breakthrough to them actually is not a good thing. Breakthrough to Chinese is inherently destabilizing, but instead slowly climbing up a value chain and keeping a competitive advantage relative to their competitors in China and outside of China, that's what they're good at. And I also think that what they're strong at is learning from abroad, because they establish very productive relationships in many cases with external institutions. This is one of the reasons why IPOs are so important, not just for raising cash amongst private companies, but also it forces them to engage in foreign markets, and that is going to result in foreign standards of corporate governance in terms of transparency and accounting and auditing. So they understand their weaknesses and they try to compensate by embracing what's good about the rest of the world and applying it in a Chinese context.
And infusing it into their own domestic enterprises.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that many people forget is that the Chinese are first and foremost concerned about what is happening here in China. Although there are many, many Chinese companies that are reasonably well distributed in emerging markets, South America, Latin America, India. Still, the main game for the majority of Chinese companies is here domestically as the lower tier cities come into purchasing power.
But you brought up earlier a point about contextual management objectives. So within the
Is
context
that what I
of China,
said? Contextual management objectives? That's very nice.
I labeled it, but that's what you said. And you know, within that context, don't you think that there's a huge influence from the way that Chinese citizens are raised and the culture itself and how they're shaped to actually fit that form of management better than perhaps their counterparts in the US and Europe to be managed for scale rather than for innovation?
I mean, I think that without lapsing into theory here, but this is a fundamentally different worldview in China. The relationship between individual and society is different, which leads to a friendliness towards the top-down imperial leadership that you see in many Chinese organizations. Without whipping up a mathematical lather, in China, the basic productive unit of society is not the individual. It has always been, it is today, and it will remain the clan, right? Whether it be the immediate family, the extended family, or even more extended. So the individual doesn't exist independent of his obligations and responsibilities to other people. So on one hand, Chinese people tend to be very protective, very regimented, hierarchical, fearful of transgressing the norm, absolutely unwilling to cross that all-important but sometimes difficult to define red line of rebellion. But on the other hand, Chinese people are also extremely ambitious. Chinese people believe that by internalizing the values of society, by mastering convention, they are able to climb up the ladder of success against a preordained mandate, societally defined mandate of success. So this tension between regimentation, hierarchy, system on one hand, and operatic ambition on the other is something that you see every day when you work with a Chinese company.
So in a recent article you published in the Huffington Post, you actually mentioned a story where sometimes you felt in your 14 years in China still as an outsider, despite the fact that perhaps in the earlier years you had experienced some success, and as soon as there was news about the US bombing, that suddenly people still looked at you again and said, oh, there's a foreigner very different from us. You know, no matter how much you integrate, no matter how well your Mandarin is, and no matter how much you write about the books, you know, here, and the businesses here. So from a American perspective, of someone who's been in China for over a decade, how do you feel that US companies have adapted to the way that Chinese has risen in the global economic scene in the last 14 years in China?
Well, in terms of, wait, I need you to clarify this question. Are you talking about in working with Chinese companies or just American or multinational companies working in China?
Both.
Well, I think there's been a lot of progress on the former, on the latter, not so much on the former. I think that over the past 14 years that I've been here, I have noticed a lot of multinational companies making less egregious errors. I have noticed that when it comes to product categories, due to the importance of Chinese consumers, there is much more of an effort to truly understand how products fit into consumers' lives. So they're not making the big mistakes.
What were some of the big mistakes they were making before?
Well, it's very basic. Like, for example, we had one, how do I put this without being impolite to a client? Food product manufacturer where many of the products are consumed before noon. And they launched with cereal, with breakfast cereal. Chinese don't like to crunch in the morning. I mean, the role of breakfast in the morning is fundamentally different than in America. Again, this is a protective society. This is a society where mothers' fundamental role is to protect their children with love, as opposed to enable them to go discover their dreams. So breakfast in the morning should be soft, it should be reassuring, it should be comforting. And so this company, you know, a decade ago or 12 years ago, had trouble just recognizing that their lead product into the category couldn't be what it would be in the United States. To own the morning would require a fundamentally different business model. And through that, they've tried to have relationships with and acquisition strategies with domestic companies. Now, I'm not talking about this company anymore, but where Chinese Americans have not gotten appreciably better, I believe, is this unquantifiable need to generate trust by signaling that a foreign company is in fact safe, that the foreign company does not pose a threat, that there's transparency, and also fundamental respect for the Chinese and the Chinese challenges that are confronted in the Chinese worldview. The Chinese are very pragmatic. The Chinese do want to establish productive partnerships, but in order for them to move forward, they first need to feel secure. And I do feel like America has not yet really gotten China. There's still not, when you go back to the States or back to Europe, a true desire to understand the fundamental motivations of Chinese people, and as you said, the entities that Chinese people make up. So I think that we still don't understand the all-importance of trust as a precursor to progress in this society.
But that's interesting. You're talking about trust from the standpoint of Chinese companies trusting foreign companies as being safe, et cetera. But wouldn't you say that as the economic power balance has actually shifted significantly over the past 10 years, that in a lot of ways, some of the new American companies that come into China in some ways are fearful of Chinese companies and the power that they possess domestically. And actually, they need to build that trust in some ways for themselves as well.
Who needs to build the trust for themselves?
The
American companies. Absolutely. I mean, trust is the $64,000 prize, not question. I do think that, and we're getting into broad topics here, but I think that the assumption that Chinese companies and Western companies, that the Chinese nation and Western nations are natural competitors and should be feared is a misperception. And I think it's a misperception that feeds on itself. If you take a look at the fundamental strengths of both on a cultural level and on a corporate level, and the fundamental weaknesses of American, Western versus Chinese entities, I think that there is a great white space and a great canvas for productive collaboration. I mean, you were talking earlier about the strengths of Chinese companies. What about the weaknesses of Chinese companies? I mean, Chinese companies, I believe, have imperial leadership that is fear-based and protective sometimes. I mean, a Chinese leader views himself as in an inherently unstable position. So I always think of the metaphor is standing on top of the mountain. In fact, I think there's a Chinese expression, right? Gao chu bu shenghan, which is, I think, a gross interpretation would be, it's lonely at the top. But they fear competition that is vertical. So as a result, there are horizontal factions and cliques that are designed to keep competition not targeting the boss. And the boss also rules with a little bit of ambiguity. Edicts are issued with just enough ambiguity to create an undercurrent of anxiety. And the result of this is that the people below tend to act very fearfully as well. And it becomes quite hierarchical. And in a hierarchical organization, new ideas, challenge to convention, particularly by the new generation, which has a broader worldview, it doesn't come out as easily. So that's a weakness. And then when you get into the area of corporate governance, there's a lot of challenge there too. Most Chinese companies, even privately owned ones, have to have one eye focused on political imperatives and the other eye focused on the bottom line. So as a result, people toggle between very different and competing end games. So I think that that means that the ability to innovate and focus on long-term shareholder gains, and by the way, shareholders here are not empowered, so there is, again, less of an incentive to focus on value added, price premiums, higher profit margins. So the Chinese are great at scale. The West in China is great at establishing very strong competitive advantage and active preference for products or brands. In an ideal world, these are two great tastes that go great together.
Correct. They work well together.
It's
They complement each other.
symbiotic, synergistic, yin and yang, however you want to talk about it. But ultimately, these issues of mutual suspicion and the fact that neither party fully trusts the other. And on a geopolitical level, America thinks that China's trying to take it over or supplant it. China thinks that America's trying to constrain it. These are all, I think, misperceptions that don't reflect the motivations of the people. And I think,
or businesses in China.
or businesses. I mean, people in an aggregated sense at whatever level of entity. And so I personally think that business, which is pragmatic, which is measurable, quantifiable, profit and loss, I think that the business community here is in a great situation, has a great stage or a platform to bit by bit, slowly but surely, achieve some better mutual understanding.
Thanks for joining us on Thoughtful China, Tom. That wraps it up for today. Be sure to subscribe to us on Tudo and YouTube. You can also follow us on Weibo and Twitter, and join our LinkedIn group. See you again.
Hi there, just a reminder, Thoughtful China and Advertising Age are collaborating on a conference about advertising in China's lower tiers in Shanghai on September 5th. Some of the country's top marketing experts will share insights about how to grow your business in China's third and fourth tier markets. And for the first time, AdAge will bring its Women to Watch Awards to China with an awards dinner held on the same day. We hope you'll join us in honoring some of the marketing industry's most promising female professionals. Tickets and further details are available now on adage.com and thoughtfulchina.com.